Good evening, everyone. My name is Mimi Plochet, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Chicago International Film Festival. And it's my great pleasure to be leading a conversation tonight around the film A Towering Task, the story of the Peace Corps. And here I have joining me the director of the film, Alana DeJoseph. Welcome, Alana.
Thank
and
you.
Writer and producer of the film, Shauna Kelly. Welcome, Shauna. It's nice to see you both. First, I'd like to thank you for sharing your film with us and our audiences. I'm going to start out with asking you a few questions to get the conversation going. For the audiences, I encourage you to add your own questions in the chat boxes, either on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you're watching it, and we would love to integrate your questions into the conversation. So first, to get started, as we've noted in some conversations that we had leading up to this, that the film and its discussion of the work and the history of the Peace Corps is perhaps more relevant and even resonant today than it was when you even first released the film at the end of last year. And I can even imagine certainly when you started conceiving of the film and started working on it. So I want to come back later in the conversation to those resonances, but I would love to just hear kind of the backstory of the film. And so maybe starting with Alana, what inspired you or sparked the decision to make this film at this point in your life as well?
So I had the pleasure and privilege to work on a documentary about the history of the U.S. Forest Service a few years back, and that agency was celebrating its 100th anniversary. So it's a little older than the Peace Corps, and it turned out there were several returned Peace Corps volunteers on the team that produced The Greatest Good, the Forest Service Centennial film. And we started talking, wondering whether there was such a thing about the Peace Corps, a documentary that was an overview of the agency and its history. And as we started digging into it, we noticed there wasn't. And at the same time, parallel to that, we realized that America was forgetting that there was a Peace Corps in the first place. So being a returned Peace Corps volunteer myself, I had gotten that question multiple times when people ask me about my life, and I would mention Peace Corps. That I would either get the "Oh, is that still around?" question, or didn't that have something to do with John F. Kennedy? And so really the impetus to make the documentary was to remind America that this is part of our U.S. citizenship. We all pay taxes. It funds a U.S. government agency that is the Peace Corps that sends average Americans overseas to countries that request them, and then has them working on the same level as the community in which they are placed. And America wasn't remembering that. And, you know, we hear a lot of things about us fighting wars overseas and a lot of negative ways America is interacting with other countries. And we're forgetting that there's actually a hopeful story, a positive story. And then, of course, as we were producing this has taken 6 years to produce. Everything changed. Suddenly, we weren't just forgetting that, you know, there were Peace Corps volunteers overseas. We were forgetting why we interacted with the rest of the world in the first place. And we were actually in 2017 in January during the inauguration. We were in Liberia, and I was getting ready for an interview with the U.S. ambassador in Monrovia. And I had this list of very inside questions about the separation between foreign policy and the Peace Corps, and it got very complex. And then I was watching the inauguration in the morning before our interview in the afternoon, and I realized that I needed to go much more basic. I needed to ask, why do we have ambassadors in other countries? Why do we communicate with other countries? What's the point? Why is this urgent? Why is this important? And it really shifted the focus a little bit of the documentary from this very philosophizing about Peace Corps and white savior and how do we work with other countries to why do we work with other countries and what's the benefit of meeting on a people-to-people level. And then of course it became even more urgent as we were talking about walls and pardon my language, whole countries, and it just this perception of the American exceptionalism got ramped up through the roof. And we realized we need to tell this story right now, not just because it's quaint to learn about the Peace Corps, because Peace Corps is mom's apple pie, right? It's this Americana of a bygone era, but because we need to know how to relate to the rest of the world when we are living in a time of global problems, of climate change, of migration, of pandemics. So yeah, suddenly went from quaint to very, very crucial that we tell this story.
Yeah, much more than just the history of the actual institution. I want to come back to kind of your shifting kind of and the structure of the film and your ideas behind it, but I wanted to go over to Shauna. You're credited as the writer of the film, and I think for a lot of people who think about documentaries, they don't think about them necessarily as having a writer. So I was wondering if you could talk about, one, how you got involved, and also what the different roles that you played in the film and putting it together and working with Alana.
Right. Well, I think, it's interesting. A lot of documentaries don't list a screenwriter, and I don't know how those scripts are put together. But for Alana and I think there was certainly there was a big learning curve for me. I started with all these transcripts, with all these interviews, and 1,000 topics, hundreds of countries, many decades, and quickly got into a place where I realized that we needed a real structure. So the first thing I think we discovered is that we really did have to use a historical timeline to take us through the story. And then, as I was pulling these sound bites from transcripts, the script wasn't really coming together the way I, wanted it to. It wasn't as interesting until I started looking at the archival stuff. Mm. And that's when it really came to life for me. And yeah, putting that one, shot of Shriver in the right spot with the right interview piece afterward, it was really all about that. Like, how do we make our point in a coherent way and in a quick way? Because we were always trying to cut down. We always had too much stuff. But for me, yeah, it's when I started really digging into the archival that the story started to take shape more historically.
Yeah, and I'm really curious about the structure of the film as well, because Alana, you also talk about that shift to the thinking about the person to person and the impact of that. And I think one of the things that struck me the first time I wrote the film is how you take this historical narrative of the Peace Corps, but then interweave it with more intimate stories of either returned volunteers or current volunteers. And so one is like, at what point did you decide kind of to shift to that structure? And two is, I'm sure there were so many people that you could have chosen from with really compelling stories. Like, how did you land on your interview subjects and make those decisions?
Well, the structure, the decision on the structure came pretty quickly because we realized that Peace Corps has been covered pretty well in books, or semi-well in books and historical pieces. The founding of the Peace Corps has been covered pretty well. The first 3 years, the JFK years. And so that's when somebody knows something about the Peace Corps, it tends to be from those first 3 years of the Peace Corps. And we realized that if we did a historical piece that was mostly about the founding years, we would do the agency more harm than good, because we would relegate it to the shelves of history again, when people didn't realize that Peace Corps volunteers were on the ground right now. Well, actually not right now they're evacuated, but at the time we were producing the film. And so we knew we had to put those current day volunteers in there, and the current day subject matters of why volunteers even needed to be on the ground still, from the contrast to the early 60s volunteers. And so we knew we needed to break it up. We needed to get to current day volunteers pretty quickly, while at the same time maintaining that arc of history. So it worked out beautifully. And Shauna is understating her role. This documentary would not exist without her skilled work of putting together the script and all the archival coordination she did. So she was so much more than a screenwriter on this film. And as far as the interviews we picked, at first we were kind of random, like who had good quotes, who was saying interesting things. And it became more and more clear that they had to be tied to that time of history that we were talking about. So we have the arc of history, and then we have little vignettes with current day volunteers that interrupt that arc of history. But during the arc of history, when we had a volunteer soundbite, we had to make sure that volunteer actually came from that era. So what they were talking about was relevant to that era. And then the current day volunteers would always tie everything right back to, well, what does that mean to us today?
I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of stories that you would have liked to included and ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. Is there any thought of doing something with those stories, with those interviews in a piece that, can live outside of the film?
Well, there are a couple things going on. So I think, one is we're going to have the bonus materials, right, that every collector's edition DVD needs. So we'll have those little pieces. We had a beautiful vignette about early volunteers fighting about who was first, because Peace Corps Ghana claims to be the first Peace Corps volunteers because they were the first ones on the ground in Ghana. But Peace Corps Colombia says, but we are the first ones who started training. Right. And then Peace Corps Tanganyika says, but we were only 2 hours later than you. We started at the same time technically, but we were in Texas and you were on the East Coast. And so it's this cute little debate of who was first. And that landed on the cutting room floor, unfortunately. So those will be little bonus materials that we'll use. The other thing, though, is that this discussion, this story has become even more important if possible. All volunteers have now been evacuated. There are no Peace Corps volunteers on the ground. And the Peace Corps is keeping the posts open, so staff are still there. And Peace Corps says it will return, but it won't be easy. Because how do you return after a pandemic when you've evacuated 7,300 plus volunteers? How do you rebuild? These volunteers are now back in the States looking for work at a very challenging time to look for work, and only some of them will be able to return, and then recruiting will have to ramp up, and hopefully there'll be more people volunteering because the job market is so terrible. So maybe that's another thing that people can do is join the Peace Corps. But we have a lot of recovering to do from a pandemic, from foreign relations that have taken a hit, where countries were insulted and the relations are frayed to the rest of the world. And so it'll be really challenging to come back. So one of the things we're thinking about is a Towering Task 2, part 2, because we would start with the evacuation and then go to how do we recover from this? How does Peace Corps rebuild? And that would probably take a couple of years to get back to where it was, if not get bigger. That's a possibility.
And certainly, thinking about that as the next chapter in the story that you're telling. But speaking of recruiting and kind of the archival footage, I was particularly struck or maybe charmed by the inclusion of the PSAs and the ways in which volunteers were recruited. So Shauna, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of uncovering those and what you discovered in that process.
Yeah, I remember one day in particular. There's one interview with John Coyne, and he mentioned a PSA in his interview. He mentioned it. It's in the movie. He mentions that half glass full thing that everybody remembers, which I didn't remember that one, but I did remember The Toughest Job You'll Ever Love, and I remembered Harry Belafonte. And so I just, saying that. And so I went onto YouTube and just started searching, and there was this unbelievable treasure trove. Every PSA just seems to perfectly emerge from whatever period it was created in. There's the 60s ones, and then there's like that weird Age of Aquarius one. I couldn't believe it when I saw that one. There was one that we didn't use that was kind of a spoof of The Graduate. So it was, somebody who was like, what are you going to do with your life? And so he's going to the Peace Corps, I guess. And that
Not into plastics, into the Peace Corps.
Not plastics, right. And then, even the ones that were, I think of them as slightly cheesier, the kind of 80s and 90s one, they so perfectly evoke that period that we realized, there are the ones that you want to include because they're odd. They're the ones that were kind of iconic. And then there were the ones that just felt like they oriented you into the period that you were in. And so, I found those to be totally charming too, and so necessary, and such a nice break, to kind of bring in that angle, but they were so hard to find. We went to the National Archives. They had some stuff. We went to the Ad Council, which actually, helped produce these pieces. And they had a shockingly kind of barren vault. They had like the paper stuff, but they didn't have any original reels, any original film. We actually went to the advertising company that did that original glass half full one and tried to get it through them, and they didn't have it either. So I found myself diving through all these rabbit holes and just to get like a decent copy of this thing I knew existed because I'd found it on YouTube. So there was a lot of conversation with Alana where I'd say, these are the technical specs. Is this better or worse than what we already have? We probably have 5 or 6 versions of some of those PSAs. And in the end, there's that one that was just a slightly better quality, but it was tough to find original, film or tape of some of this older stuff. It was a real challenge.
Yeah, and it raises interesting. Oh, Alana, did you want to add something?
Yeah, Doug. And Shauna doesn't even know this yet. I actually got an email recently from a young man who was a Peace Corps volunteer. Or, well, he was a young man at the time. He was a Peace Corps volunteer, and he wrote an email saying, "Friends of mine just watched the movie A Towering Task, and they told me I'm in it." And it turned out he was the young man who was in the Eastern Europe public service announcements, running up the stairs into this fancy library. And he was talking about, he said he wasn't a volunteer in Hungary. He was staff from headquarters. And at headquarters, they had been deciding that they needed to shoot a PSA for this new entry into Eastern Europe. And so they interviewed a few people at headquarters who would make the right person. And so then a week later, they shipped them to Hungary, and they were recording it there. And they kept picking all these iconic, beautiful, fancy buildings in Budapest. And he said, I don't think this is what Peace Corps volunteer life is going to look like. It's probably going to be much more those communist block type buildings and stuff. But so I just got that email saying, I'm in your movie. It was wonderful.
Well, it made me think too, like and going back to kind of thinking about the next chapter or even the impact of the film, like what would a PSA look like today, right? But also, in terms of thinking about if when the rebuilding takes place, or new recruitment of volunteers, like how might this film have an impact on that? And I was wondering if what kind of conversations you've had around that or thought you've given to that.
Well, I've heard that Peace Corps is looking hard at itself in how to build better, rebuild better. And, for anybody who's been a Peace Corps volunteer, it's, that Peace Corps has always struggled with diversity. It's hard to take 2 years of your life and go overseas and not really earn an income and then come back and kind of have to start a career. If you're entering the Foreign Service, the Peace Corps is a great way to start that career. But for many other careers, the Peace Corps is not necessarily the best start technically for the career. Emotionally and personally, obviously, it's a great growth experience. So I've heard conversations around that. I've heard about Peace Corps discussing how do we make sure we represent America better so that when other people are seeing this people-to-people connection, this face of America, it actually is the face of America and not just, early 20 Caucasian recent college grads. Not that is all the Peace Corps has. The Peace Corps has done a decent job of working on its diversity, but it certainly can do much better. I'm hoping that the documentary helps a little bit with that. We didn't get too much into that discussion, unfortunately, although we did interview a fair amount of African-American Peace Corps volunteers who have a very different experience. My best friend in Mali, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and she was my partner Peace Corps volunteer, we were in training together. She was African-American, and in Mali, oftentimes, when you're a white person, the little children will call after you Tubabu, which is the term that I think started with the French doctors entering Mali, and she would be called Tubabu Parafin, which meant a white person with black skin. And so she was still different, but then different from being different. And we interviewed a lady who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, and she was African-American, came from Alabama, and I said to her, it wasn't as big a shock to have an outdoor toilet or no running water. That's how she grew up. But at the same time, when she showed up at her village, the Malawians said to her, you possibly can't be our Peace Corps volunteer because Peace Corps volunteers are white. We don't want a black Peace Corps volunteer. You go somewhere else. And it was horrible. And so it's a very different experience. And we weren't able to integrate that enough into our documentary because we ran out of time, but it's an important discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to build some video around that as well.
Yeah, thinking about, again, how does America represent itself to the world through the Peace Corps? We do have a question from an audience member, which ties into my next question around Annette Benning and getting her to be involved with the project as the narrator. But the question is also about, you have a wide array of returned volunteers, from a New Yorker journalist and President Carter to director Taylor Hackford. someone whose work we've shown quite consistently and honored at the Chicago International Film Festival. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about, this one, getting Annette Bening involved, and is she a returned volunteer, and kind of that decision to include, some higher profile returned volunteers.
Absolutely. So as far as Annette Bening goes, we knew we needed a celebrity narrator. If you've ever distributed a documentary, it makes all the difference in the world. For example, I worked on a documentary about conservationist Aldo Leopold called Green Fire, Aldo Leopold and a Land Ethic for Our Time. And when we produced that film, at the same time, there was a gentleman out of Berkeley producing a film about Berkeley in the 60s. He had gotten a lot of footage from the university and was putting together this historical piece. And he had later then switched over to a documentary about the environmental movement. And he wanted to call it Green Fire. And we talked to him. We said, you really need to call it Green Fire because Leopold coined the term. And so we really need to have it for the Leopold documentary, but he stuck with Green Fire. And he had a plethora of celebrity narrators. He had Robert Redford and Meryl Streep and whatnot. And we had Peter Coyote, who's awesome too, but not quite as known as maybe Meryl Streep and Robert Redford are. And so I just helped distribute Green Fire then. And I oftentimes found myself on the phone saying, yes, I'm calling about Green Fire. And they're like, oh, is that the one with Robert Redford? And I always had to say, no, we're the one with Peter Coyote. And so I knew that, having an A-lister narrator is important, because especially the Peace Corps, which has become such an inside baseball topic for the Peace Corps community, it needed to reach out to a general public, and it needed to have some kind of hook for somebody to be interested, to be checking into the story. And so when we interviewed Taylor Hackford, actually, I mentioned it to him. I said, we really need a celebrity narrator. Who would you recommend? What ideas do you have? And we discussed a little bit. And of course, his wife is Helen Mirren. And I said, she would be so wonderful and all, but she's British, and this is about an American government agency. And although she would probably do a fabulous American accent, we should probably have somebody American. And so then a week or two later, he wrote me an email and he said, would Annette Bening do? And I almost fell from my chair. I'm like, oh my gosh, of course Annette Bening would do. She's fabulous. She's wonderful. And turns out they're good friends with Annette Bening, and Annette agreed to narrate our documentary. And she was as gracious a person as you can imagine. We love to tell the story. We were sitting in the studio waiting for her and having all these scenarios of what that would look like when Annette Bening walks in, and we thought maybe she'll come with an entourage and we'll deal with all the little minions coming and making us sit in just the right place and everything. She came by herself with open arms, said, I'm a hugger. I hope that's okay. And we just about melted on the floor because, I've been in love with Annette Bening ever since. So she was fabulous. And then in terms of the other higher profile volunteers we interviewed, it was a little bit like a cookie trail where you would interview one person and then they would point you to the next person, and then they would point you to the next person, and always with the thought of what angle do they have. So I love the journalists among in the documentary, because they just have a good critical eye. They're good storytellers. They know how to put together a good strong soundbite that really represents what needs to be said. And so Peter Hessler of the New Yorker, he was fantastic, and we could put hours and hours of his footage in there. Maureen Orth of Vanity Fair, she was brilliant. Of course, Maria Shriver, who we had in there briefly too, NBC, she was brilliant. So I love the journalists for their thoughtful perspective. The politicians were great because they could address the cloak and dagger stuff, the difficulties of maintaining, first building a government agency and then bringing it past all these administrations, some of whom were not very favorably inclined towards the Peace Corps. So that's how we ended up with these voices. And of course, Jimmy Carter was so powerful. He was such a lovely interview. He's the other person I'm in love with in the documentary, of course, besides all the other wonderful interviews. He was so kind and so nice when we interviewed him. And the temptation was there to splatter him all over the documentary because, of course, he's Jimmy Carter. Why wouldn't you? But then we were put back to okay, it needs to make sense for the time. It needs to make sense where it happens. And so I loved how Shauna actually wrote him into the script in this very diligent manner. So he reflected the 70s for us. And then when he talked about his mom, and we saw his mom there on stage. And then when he talked about his grandson, Jason Carter, who was a volunteer in South Africa. And you see this pride in his eyes when he's talking about he's the only person who's had a mother and a grandson in the Peace Corps. It just sparks such joy.
Yeah, I mean, so Shauna, I was wondering if you could then talk about, I think, and very clearly the foundation, the founding of the Peace Corps and the ups and downs are so clearly tied with, I think, kind of political and cultural moments in our national history. And I think the documentary is very kind of clear about elucidating that. And one of the things, and you bringing up President Carter's mother made me think of this, is that early on, so many of the volunteers were women because relatively there were many fewer career opportunities for them at that moment. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about one, kind of thinking about how to keep that tightness around tying it to the political and the cultural moments. And then also like how the volunteers, and maybe thinking more currently, have changed over time, depending on what's happening politically and culturally.
Right. Yeah, I think it was a little surprising, some of the connections that we found between historical events and Peace Corps volunteers. And I think every time, we're taking this 60-year trip through history, you can't cover everything, but everything we included, we had to ask ourselves, how does this connect back to our story? Is this tragic event the Peace Corps' tragic event? For instance, including Benghazi, of course, that never would have been part of it if Chris Stevens hadn't been a volunteer. And that, brought such an interesting angle to that story that I wasn't aware of. Even the Vietnam War clearly had to be part of our story. But I was a little reluctant at first. I wasn't sure how or why or, how exactly it fit in. And, when we started to see, there's that one story of the Peace Corps volunteer, or of the Peace Corps offices being taken over as part of a protest. Yeah. Oh, that ties it in. And that ties it into the kind of mood of the country at that moment. And why was the country like that? Well, it had to do with the fact that we were at war, and it did make the Peace Corps less appealing to people. So, there were things that kind of fell to the wayside because they didn't tie into the story. But honestly, it wasn't that hard to find interesting historical events that did tie in. The whole section with the fall of the Berlin Wall and how that affected the countries that then opened up. It's, it makes the story not just about the Peace Corps, but about this history that we all know, and giving you that kind of slightly different angle on it. Like, oh, I didn't know. Of course that happened. Of course all those countries opened up. But and in that case, that also ties into a big change in what the volunteers looked like. That was a period where, during the 80s and the 90s, where I think the age of the average age of the volunteer went up by quite a bit. They were recruiting more retired people. I do think, because of the way it was formed, because it was first kind of conceived on a college campus, and, college students and graduate students were so much associated with it. In the beginning, those were the volunteers for the most part. And I do think that the Peace Corps has been working ever since to expand the parameters, like to say, hey, we want those people who have all that experience. We want diversity. From the start, they wanted it. But as Alana said, it was an uphill battle recruiting and finding and, getting people who could actually be volunteers. I don't know if I answered all your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think now it's probably as diverse as it's ever been, right, Alana? Like, I think that it has, it's still got a ways to go, and we hope that, when it comes back, they can, maybe they can rethink the way that they recruit in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, and then I guess another question that I had around that, because of all the research that you did, was there something, I guess maybe for Solana, that really surprised you, that having been a volunteer, you had no idea was part of the history, in the process of making the film, that you found out?
You know, it's embarrassing to admit, but I knew very little about the history of the Peace Corps. When you join the Peace Corps, you have 3 months of training, you get some paperwork. I think that we got like a 2-pager or so that had some important historical moments for the Peace Corps. But in general, even the Peace Corps community wasn't very informed about what happened with the history, that there were 3 returned Peace Corps volunteers among the hostages in the Iran hostage crisis, that Peace Corps volunteers who can Skype and home and stream Netflix, the post-internet era, or the internet era of Peace Corps volunteers, that they at the same time still have the same challenges that the early volunteers did. That I had no idea about the outward bound training that the early volunteers did, the rappelling off the mountains and the.
So you didn't have to do that.
Oh no, we didn't have to do that at all. And mind you, I never had to swim with my hands and feet tied behind my back my entire 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer. So that skill would not necessarily have helped me all that much. Although, of course, the philosophy of outward bound, as I understand it, came out of World War II, where they were trying to figure out why did some soldiers, or I think it was the submariners actually, who survived and some wouldn't survive, and they were trying to figure out what kind of training would improve people's survival chances, and that's where outward bound came from. So it was this training in tenacity and confronting something in your life that you've never had before and overcoming it. And I think in the documentary, Kirby Jones points it out so well. He was saying, well, he had never swam across the pool with his hands and feet tied behind his back, but he also had never walked into a barrio in Santo Domingo before, and so he felt emboldened by it. We did not have that at all in our training, but tenacity, I think, builds after those 3 months of training that we had in our villages as well. So there were plenty of surprises, because a lot of it was new to me, and I've had Peace Corps directors, former Peace Corps directors, come up to me and say, I learned some stuff about the Peace Corps that I didn't know. So we revealed some secrets.
I mean, that kind of feeds into my next question, because I know you've had kind of overwhelming support for the film from the return volunteer community. But I was wondering about kind of what the Peace Corps itself right now, what the response to the film has been, and leadership is what their response to the film has been.
Well, it's been so interesting, because I'm getting emails from Peace Corps countries where they're saying, we want to use this film in our training because we want to bring volunteers up to speed on the history of the Peace Corps. And we've gotten emails from return volunteers in countries that want to show to the Peace Corps. We've actually had some virtual screenings with some countries where they just, right now, because everybody's evacuated, they're trying to keep their tribe together. They're trying to keep the communication going, so that when countries can open back up again, that those volunteers are still feeling engaged. And so it's for the most part, I would say very positive. The Peace Corps has been very supportive throughout the production of this documentary. We, of course, had to keep our journalistic distance the entire time to make sure this is a documentary and not a recruitment piece or a celebratory piece. And Peace Corps was very respectful of that. They never tried to influence the story, and we were respectful of them in not wanting to turn this into a 2020 expose either, not to malign 2020 by any means, but we didn't want to. This wasn't supposed to be a gotcha piece, and it wasn't supposed to be a celebratory piece. It was very much supposed to be this informative history about the Peace Corps for a general American audience.
Great. Shauna, was there anything that was, I wanted to answer that original question too, was there anything that was particularly like a surprise to you in your research that maybe stood out more than?
You know, the 80s were a surprising era to me, and I think Alana came to this project knowing about Laurette Miller-Rupe and what an important director she was, and kind of what a surprising part of the story that was going to be. So I remember her telling me that very early on. But it took such an interesting shape. There was so much happening then in terms of the Peace Corps kind of being out of vogue and off people's radar and just out of sync with what was happening in America, at least. And then how the famine in Africa then, provided a purpose for the agency, and how this really strong director, a conservative person politically, brought the agency back to life with the support of this famously conservative president. So, I mean, part of what I love about our movie and about the Peace Corps is this nonpartisan angle. We wanted to be sure, we weren't talking about Republican or Democrat most of the time, but people know history and they kind of know, these presidents. So we hope. I feel like that's such a surprising turn in the movie, and actually there's more depth there than I realized when I first started working on that part. There's almost too much. I mean, we practically could have done an hour on the 80s, and I think at one point we probably had that. So
you can turn it into a mini series.
That's right. That's the next step. But the other thing and this is something Alana kind of touched on, is the what was out there in terms of the historical record for the Peace Corps. It generally, I don't know that I found anything that went past like 1990. That was probably the most contemporary, like kind of historical. There are a lot of books written about the Peace Corps, but the years after that, it was really a little bit of a blank slate. And it was this opportunity to tell a history that we felt like really hadn't been told. And that felt like this amazing privilege and, kind of an honor, but also something we really wanted to get right. There were a lot of sad stories to tell kind of post millennium. And we tried to balance it out, but we felt like they were important to keep in there, for the story.
Yeah, I mean, both as documentary filmmakers, that question of accountability, and then also to the institution itself. We talked about, that you bring up, and I think throughout the film, we get that strong sense of what the three goals of the Peace Corps are in terms of technical assistance, having citizens or people in the countries where volunteers serve get to know Americans through that person-to-person contact, but then also the impact that the volunteers have in terms of international understanding after they return home, and how that's quite long-lasting. But, one of the issues that, I feel that gets brought up in a lot of sectors is, how do you measure impact, right? And, you're telling the story of the Peace Corps through those stories and the importance of kind of those stories. But I think this question of how do you measure impact is so important and fundamental to maybe the survival of the Peace Corps moving forward. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, because I know you touch on it, about this idea of quantifying impact, and kind of the documentary's maybe role in moving forward with something like that.
Well, and the Peace Corps owes it to the American public to explain its impact. And actually, I was at a conference a few years ago, and a lady said, let's define the word impact. The impact is really a short, violent encounter. Is that what we are looking for? And I think that is very reflective what Peace Corps should be measuring. Maybe not so much impact as in outcomes, as in influence, as in and transformative effects. And that's always been really challenging for the Peace Corps, because it is definitely qualitative studies that the Peace Corps shows, and not so much quantitative studies. And for a while there was a big push towards quantitative studies, and the education Peace Corps volunteers, they started reveling in these new numbers, because what was being measured was host-country national encounters or interactions. So if you were an education volunteer and you were teaching math or English in a classroom, you had a lot of those interactions. Mm-hmm. If you were a water volunteer who had one counterpart and you would go out and dig wells or consult on various water projects, you might have this one person as your interaction for your 2 years. And it was such a perfect example of how numbers can be completely misleading, of one volunteer being more successful over another just by host country national encounters. So while Peace Corps has to explain what it does, what the actual outcomes and actual effects are of the Peace Corps, it's crucial to know how to do that. And Peace Corps has been struggling a lot with that. And part of that is because Peace Corps has not been studied a lot. There's very little scholarship on the Peace Corps. And so gathering that information, even gathering the information for this documentary, we had to go through so many archives and people's attics and basements, and finding all this material was very, very difficult. And so one of the things we started on our website was a resources page in hopes to encourage future scholars. And so Peace Corps needs to be studied more. There need to be more theses, more dissertations, more books written about the Peace Corps, so that impact or these outcomes, this influence can be better understood. And not just for America, who is funding this with their tax dollars and is getting these better global citizens back from that Peace Corps experience, but also for the host countries, because we don't want to use the world as the training ground for our young 20-somethings. We want host countries to be gaining something from this. And so there needs to be accountability too of what's the outcome for the countries? What are they gaining from having Peace Corps volunteers there?
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to bring the conversation back around now. I think we're getting close to an end, to kind of coming back to that question of resonance and the current moment. And, you know, one of the last segments of the documentary talks about the outbreak of the Ebola virus and the role that the Peace Corps volunteers played in helping to address that. And here we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, it just, I think, resonates so much with where we are now. But like, as you mentioned before, Alana, the volunteers have all been brought back to the US. And, you know, I don't know if, I guess I don't really have a question, but, you know, maybe just some thoughts on, like, you know, where and how the documentary or the work of the Peace Corps is resonating right now.
It's a really interesting discussion, because whenever Peace Corps volunteers get evacuated, most volunteers want to stay. They don't want to be evacuated because they've integrated into these communities. And when things get bad, the last thing the Peace Corps volunteers want to do is abandon their communities. So evacuations are always really difficult. And so the discussion that came out of that for many Peace Corps volunteers, evacuated Peace Corps volunteers, and then the return Peace Corps volunteer community was have evacuated. Wouldn't this have been a time when Peace Corps volunteers were more needed rather than less needed? And that's always been the discussion when evacuations happen. And, you know, I realize that it would have been incredibly difficult for the Peace Corps to keep the volunteers on the ground, especially when travel restrictions became omnipresent and airports were closing, and volunteers might not have been able to be gotten out of countries, even if they had, you know, an accident or injuries or something like that. So it's very, very difficult for the Peace Corps to figure out what to do, and it's in a time like this. I was looking at the website of the VSO, the Volunteer Service Organization of the United Kingdom, and they kept their volunteers on the ground and talked about how they're modifying how they're working, but they have the volunteers out there. I looked at the Australian volunteer agency that is similar to the Peace Corps, and they evacuated everybody. It seems like everybody is making their own decisions in how to do it. One of the suggestions that has come up here in America is we now have these 7,300 plus incredibly skilled culture bridgers. And what do we need more during a time when there's a census, when there's a pandemic going on, when we have racial justice protests going on, than people who can bridge cultures? So can we not deploy these 7,300 plus evacuated Peace Corps volunteer in some way domestically to help with these unique skills that they have? So I think it's incredibly inspiring that these discussions are going on. To see what comes out of it tangibly afterwards will be interesting. And much has to do with leadership. I think the Peace Corps is really lucky to have Jody Olson at the helm right now. She has been with the Peace Corps volunteers since she was a volunteer. And in various forms as staff. And she has some important and crucial decisions to make that will impact the future of the Peace Corps. Some of it has to do with the realities on the ground, what is possible and what is not possible. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. Shauna, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just that, you know, when we were talking about what makes the Peace Corps, you know, why are people going to care about this movie? You know, where are they going to connect? And this was something that we came up over and over again. And of course, I was always hopeful that people just cared about the agency, but I think to a certain extent did come to these global events and, you know, just evolution that's bringing us closer together. It's technology. You know, there are some positives when it comes to the way we're all connected. But then, I mean, I think for me, I thought the most pressing one was probably climate change. You know, even though we had this Ebola story to tell, I just never imagined that our point was going to be made quite so literally, and I never wanted it to be. But, you know, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf says the line about, you know, our own experience with Ebola teaches us that diseases too cross borders without a passport. I mean, when I heard that the first time, I was like, oh God, that's definitely going in. But now it's just so sadly true.
Yeah.
And I think that these connections are more important than ever, because if anything, you know, it's pulling us apart. It's making us, you know, pay attention to borders in a way that we haven't in you know, years and years. And there's a danger there, I think, of just pulling in to ourselves again, isolating ourselves, when what we really should be doing is reaching out. And that's what these Peace Corps volunteers, all the return volunteers, are so good at doing too.
And I talked to a 60s volunteer recently who was saying it was scary in the 60s to go out and be a Peace Corps volunteer. We will find that we'll be a little more fearful of the rest of the world after this pandemic, and we will want to feel more isolated and build walls and whatnot. But even back in the 60s, to step out and make those person-to-person connections was difficult, and it'll be difficult now again. But I think that's why we need these stories of hope and courage and tenacity, which is really what the Peace Corps is all about.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing the film with us, for having this discussion tonight. And definitely, we look forward to the next chapter. I know we all wish that we had that crystal ball to see what it was going to be, but yeah, I do think what's next for us as a country and the Peace Corps as an agency is something that we'd love to hear that story told.
Well, thank you so much for having us. This was such
Yes.
a honor.
Yeah, thank you, Alana.
Thank you, everybody, for watching, and yeah, for the opportunity to just connect with people outside of my home.
A different type of person to person. Thank you all. Have a great night to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.